Hello everybody, and thank you for joining me. I'm Roy Peachey, and I'm the author of 4 recent books, a couple of books about education, another one called 50 Books for Life, which is a guide to some great literature that was written during the last 2,000 years, and the book I particularly want to talk to you about today, let's get it that way, Between Darkness and Light, which is a novel about the Chinese Labour Corps during World War I. And I'll get onto that a little bit later. But I've been sent some very interesting questions, so I'll work my way through those. And the first question was, what was my favourite childhood book? I found that really difficult to answer because at different stages in my childhood I had different favourites. So for a long while it was this one, All About Cricket by Brian Johnston, and that's Derek Randall there doing his famous cartwheel. Another point it was this one, my favourite escape stories by Pat Reed. And if you look inside you'll get some sort of indication, let's go that way, of what sort of child I was. Bookworm, not quite sure where the fire chief bit fitted in. For a long time it was this book actually, Stories of the Ancient Britons by Marjorie Morris. You know, there's a impressive ancient Britain. And then when I got a bit older, like many people, I got completely engrossed in The Lord of the Rings. All 1,000+ pages of it. And it only really struck me when I was asked that question that all of those are united by history. They're all about history in some ways. Brian Johnston's book is about the history of cricket. The other two are fairly obviously historical books. But even The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien said it was an imagined history. So this interest in history has run through my life. And my first degree was in modern history. Modern history meaning everything from the Romans onwards. And but then I went and did an English degree at the Open University after that, and then followed that up with an MA in Chinese Studies at SOAS. So that intersection between literature and history has always been very important to me. What am I reading at the moment? Well, at night time, my bedtime reading, I tend to have various books on the go. So I've got a children's book, which is, there we are, The Mitchells, Five for Victory by Hilda van Stockum. Wonderful children's author, hardly known really in this country, and yet she really should be. Wonderful, wonderful writer. And I'm working on an article at the moment about that's a rather strange front cover, about the Desert Fathers. So I'm reading that as well. So how's that all fed into my own writing? Well, the next question was about how much research I do and what sort of research I do. So I think it's probably easiest if I show you some of the research I did for Between Darkness and Light. Of course, I did all the obvious things. I went to the British Library, I went to university libraries, I got hold of the British Journal of Ophthalmology 1920 because my book is about blindness and sight. That idea runs through the whole thing. I'll tell you about that in a bit. But I also had to go on some fact-finding trips. So I diverted from a family holiday in France and visited a tiny little village called Noyelles-sur-Mer. So here we are at Noyelles-sur-Mer. It's a very ordinary little French village at the mouth of the Somme. Beautiful little place, but tiny. And yet there at the entrance to the village are these rather surprising statues. What on earth are they doing there? Well, walk along the road and you'll get an idea. It's a Chinese cemetery. And not just any old Chinese cemetery, a rather large one, 841 graves of Chinese labourers who died during the First World War. China had offered the Allies troops and had been turned down for all sorts of bad reasons. And then, in order to win a seat at the negotiating table at the end of the war, because they'd lost some territory to the Japanese, they offered Chinese labourers. And this offer was eventually accepted, and the labourers came and worked, digging trenches, working on the railways, working in ports, doing all sorts of dirty work. And lots of them died. Huge numbers died. And I found this gravestone very moving, this poor labourer who died on Armistice Day itself. And yet when I walked down the row, I found gravestone after gravestone of people who died after Armistice Day, right up to this poor guy who died March the 23rd, 1920. What on earth was going on? Well, part of the answer was that the Chinese labourers were involved in battleground clearance at the end of the war. They were clearing the old battlegrounds of debris, which involved dead bodies, unexploded ordnance, shells, bombs, many of which blew up in their faces, and hundreds of them were killed. Over half the graves at Noailles-sur-Mer are of labourers who died after Armistice Day 1918. And I found this very moving. So these stories worked their way into my novel. And another question that I was sent was about how I come up with the ideas for the names of my characters. That one threw me, I have to confess, because I couldn't quite remember. I've drawn names, I think, from all over the place. I'm sure some of the tombstones at Noailles, various other bits of reading I've done, and then just names that seemed to fit. There's one name in Between Darkness and Light, which is a bit of an English teacher's joke, but I'm not going to tell you what that is. You'll have to read the book and see if you can figure it out. But there was one little, well, how do I describe it? A slightly nerdy joke in there, I suppose. Next question is, are you friends with other authors, and do they help you? I have to say that writing is a fairly solitary task. It's a fairly solitary job, but various writers have helped me definitely in the past. So when I was still fairly young, I worked with Neil Curry, the poet, and he gave me some really kind and helpful advice. And then later on I taught with Louisa Reed, the children's novelist, and neither of us had been published at that point, and we just encouraged each other along. So that was very useful for mutual support. Now I occasionally meet up with Fiorella de Maria, who writes some lovely novels. But by and large, I have to say, I'm my own harshest critic, and I just work away at it. I beaver away at my writing whenever I can. Did I attend any book groups or any writing groups? Well, I only attended one writing group. I did a weekend at the Faber Academy, which was very useful. It was good to hear about what other people were doing who were also sort of stuck in the middle of a novel as I was at that point. So I suppose it helped me unclog the writing process. And a particularly interesting moment there for me was meeting a motoring correspondent from one of the national newspapers who was writing a novel at the time. And everybody else was talking about writer's block and how they couldn't get going. And he said, look, as a journalist, I just have to whack out a certain number of words each day. So getting things down on the page is no problem at all. The issue is making sure the quality is good. And I found that really useful, because I think sometimes the blank page can be the biggest enemy to the writer. And if you can just work your way through it, just churn out the words, all sorts of rewriting can go on afterwards. If you just churn out the words, then that is really important. Book groups, yeah, occasionally I've been part of a book group, not a great deal I have to say, and one of the great pleasures of becoming a published author is that I've managed to go around and talk to various book groups, and I've really enjoyed that. So if there's anybody out there who wants me to come and talk about my book or any of my books at a book group, very happy to do that, of course. And what's my favourite scene to write? Well, I perhaps ought to now start talking a little bit more about the book then. So, Between Darkness and Light starts with a catastrophic accident. Wang Wei-jun, who is the protagonist of the book, is playing a game of William Tell with his childhood friend. He's 8 years old at the time, and it goes badly wrong, and he gets an arrow in his eye. So right at the start of the book, he's blinded. He loses this eye, and he's taken off to hospital. They tried to save the eye and they failed to save it. So chapter 2, he's taken off to the oculist to choose a replacement eye. He's got this enamel eyepiece. And that gave me the opportunity to write my first little bit of humour in the book. I quite enjoyed writing that. And throughout this book, which has some pretty dark moments, it's about World War One, it's about a great deal of suffering, it's about the experience of the Chinese Labour Corps, who were really horribly treated at times. There are also moments of light, definite moments of light, and I think those are the ones I enjoyed writing in particular. So when I was doing my final proofread of the book for the publisher, I found myself laughing at some of my own jokes, which was encouraging. Maybe tells you a lot about my sense of humour. But there we are. It was a good read, I thought. I enjoyed writing it, and then I enjoyed reading it again afterwards. So I think those scenes which are comic scenes were the ones I enjoyed particularly. And I can't give too much away without giving away the plot, but there's a football match, for example, in France between the labourers, the Chinese labourers, and the British officers. And I really enjoyed writing that. That was quite fun. How long does it take to get a book from the first words on the page to publication? Well, I did my initial research in 2008, and it came out in 2019. I think that's right. So 11 years. Now that may be unusually long, but often it really can be a very long haul, the writing business. I'm excited that I've got a children's book coming out next year, my first children's novel called The Race, about the parallel lives of Eric Liddell, of Chariots of Fire fame, and what he did after the Olympics, and a young girl in contemporary Britain. And that I wrote much, much more quickly. And that probably took me 6 months to a year, I guess, something like that. Which brings me to the final question. What advice would I give to my younger self about if I was just starting to write? And I think the two key bits of advice I would give, number one, is to be aware of the fact that writing, at least for me, takes longer than reading. So you have to write a great deal more about a particular scene or a character than you think you do, because the reader reads it very, very quickly, whereas it may take you a long time to write. So to make sure the reader is seeing what you're seeing, you really have to write for slightly longer, much longer, more words on the page for it to really hit home. And the second piece of advice I think I would give is connected with something I heard Frank Cottrell Boyce, the children's author, once say in a lecture. And he was talking about John Henry Newman. And he pointed out that John Henry Newman's great work, Apologia Pro Vita Sua, was written as a response to a controversy. It was written at top speed. Newman was writing 20 hours a day, and he churned this book out incredibly quickly. And yet, Frank Cottrell Boyce points out, it's got the most luminous prose of the 19th century. Beautifully written, really beautifully written book. And I think for a long time, I was looking for the perfect writing environment. I wanted a writing shed in my garden. I wanted absolute peace and tranquility. And of course, all those things are impossible. And what Frank Cottrell Boyce said was that we just need to seize the moments when we've got them. And he was touring the country at the time in a dormobile, because he'd just written the sequel to the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang books. And in the sequels, there's this dormobile flying around the place. So he was touring around the country, promoting his book in this dormobile. And so he was writing in lay-bys. He was writing by the side of the road. And that made a big impression on me. And ever since then, I've just grabbed moments where I can. 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, an hour or two if I can get it. And I've been much, much more productive. So that would be certainly the advice I would give to my younger self. So if you want to know any more about the book, please do get in contact with me. I'm on roypeachey.com, also on Twitter and LinkedIn and all the rest of it. So please feel free to get in contact. It would be lovely to hear from you. Thanks very much for having afternoon tea with me. Cheers.